attic of American folklore, there are a few tales that have captured the public imagination, quite like the story of Roland Doe. It's a narrative that has everything. A young boy, allegedly possessed by demonic forces, desperate parents, valiant priests, and a terrifying battle between good and evil. Now, this case, which unfolded in 1949, would go on to inspire the best-selling novel, The Exorcist, and its even more famous film adaptation.
What about The Exorcist?
But what if I told you that the story you think you know, that one that's kept generations of moviegoers awake at night, might be built on a foundation of misunderstandings, exaggerations, and perhaps even deliberate fabrications? And yet, what if there's still a kernel of truth at its core, one that might speak to deeper realities? Let's start at the beginning. Or rather, let's start where most people think the story begins, with a Ouija board. The popular narrative tells us that young Roland, a pseudonym used to protect the boy's identity, that he began communicating with his recently deceased aunt through a Ouija board. And shortly after, strange phenomenon began to occur around the boy. Objects moved on their own, mysterious scratching noise emanated from the walls, and his bed shook violently in the night. It's a chilling setup, isn't it? The innocent child, the forbidden occult object, the escalating supernatural activity. It's almost too perfect. And that's precisely why we should be skeptical. And here's where things get interesting. In my research, I came across the meticulous work of Mark Opensnake, a local historian who spent years investigating this case. And his findings challenge nearly every aspect of the narrative. First, let's consider the Ouija board. According to his interviews with Roland's former classmates, the boy never owned such a device. In fact, Roland was described as a rather ordinary kid, maybe even a bit spoiled, but certainly not one given to occult dabbling. So where did the Ouija board story come from? Well, it appears to have been a later addition, possibly introduced by the priests involved in the cases or by early newspaper reporters. The Ouija board, with its mysterious reputation, it provided a convenient explanation for the inexplicable. It was that narrative hook, it was just too good to resist. But if there was no Ouija board, what really happened to Roland Doe? And to answer that question, we need to step back and consider the broader context of 1940s America. This was a time of great change and uncertainty. The country had just emerged from World War II, and the Cold War was looming on the horizon. The threat of nuclear annihilation, it hung over everyone's head. And in times of such upheaval, it's not uncommon for people to seek explanations in the supernatural, or to turn to faith for comfort and understanding. Moreover, the late 1940s, they saw a surge of interest in parapsychological and the occult. The famous Rhine experiments at Duke University, which purported to prove the existence of ESP, were still fresh in the public mind. Popular magazines regularly featured stories of hauntings and psychic phenomenon. So it's against this backdrop that Roland's story unfolds. But what exactly was that story? According to the family, strange events began occurring in their Maryland home in January 1949. Objects moved without being touched. Scratching sounds were heard in the walls. Roland's bed shook at night. These claims on their own are not particularly unusual. Paranormal researchers have long noted the poltergeist activity often centers around adolescents, particularly those undergoing emotional turmoil. And Roland, he's 13, he's at the right age. But here's where things get murky. The family, devout Catholics, quickly interpreted these events through a religious lens. They contacted their parish priests, who in turn reached out to his superiors. Before long, the case had caught the attention of several Jesuit priests, including Father William Bowdern, who would eventually perform the exorcism. Now let's pause for a moment and consider the dynamics at play here. We have a troubled adolescence, a concerned family, and a group of priests primed to see demonic influence. It's a potent combination, one that could easily lead to a kind of collective delusion. But from a faith perspective, we must also consider another possibility, that there was indeed a spiritual dimension to Roland's struggles. After all, as Christians, we believe in the reality of spiritual warfare, as described in Ephesians 6:12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm. So how do we reconcile these different perspectives? How do we approach a case like Roland's with both critical thinking, but also spiritual openness? And one way is to look at the details of the case through the lens of both psychology and faith. Consider some of the symptoms reported during Roland's supposed possession. He spoke in a guttural voice. He displayed aversion to sacred objects. He exhibited superhuman strength. Now, to a skeptical ear, these sound suspiciously like the standard tropes of demonic possession, the very tropes that The Exorcist would later cement in popular culture. But to a believer, they might align with the biblical account of demonic activity, such as the man possessed by Legion in Mark 5. However, what if Roland was simply a troubled teenager acting out? What if his superhuman strength was just the adrenaline-fueled struggle of a panicked adolescence? What if his guttural voice was a deliberate performance, either as a cry for attention or as a response to the expectations placed upon him? Now, these are not idle speculations. In fact, there's compelling evidence to suggest that Roland was indeed playing a role, perhaps not consciously, but playing a role nonetheless. 1949, two psychologists, E.E. Burt and F.W. Bunker, had the opportunity to observe Roland during his stay at Georgetown University Hospital. And their report, long overlooked in discussions of the case, paints a very different picture than the one we might be familiar with. Burt and Bunker describe Roland as a spoiled, disturbed boy who had learned to play up his symptoms to gain attention. They noticed that his demonic behavior seemed to occur only when he had an audience, particularly when that audience included priests. And this observation aligns with what we know about the power of social roles. When people are placed in a particular role, say that of a possessed individual, they often begin to act in ways that conform to the expectations associated with the role. But here's where it gets interesting from a faith perspective. Even if Roland was acting it out, even if his behavior was largely psychological, could there still have been a spiritual component to his struggles? After all, as Christians, we believe that spiritual forces can work through our psychological weaknesses and social dynamics. And it brings us to a crucial question. If Roland's case was more complex than simple possession, why did the exorcism seem to work? Why did his symptoms eventually subside? Now, from a psychological standpoint, we can consider the power of ritual. Regardless of one's belief about the supernatural, it's clear that rituals can have profound psychological effects. The exorcism, with its solemn prayers and dramatic confrontation with the demon, may have provided Roland with a socially acceptable way to process and ultimately let go of his troubled behavior. From a faith perspective, we might see the efficacy of the exorcism as evidence of the power of prayer and the authority of Christ over all forces. As James 5:16 states, the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Moreover, the exorcism marked a clear endpoint to the possession. Once it was over, there was no longer any reason for Roland to continue his unusual behavior. The role had been played out to its conclusion. But if this is the case, if Roland's possession was more psychological than supernatural, or perhaps a complex interplay of both, why has the story persisted for so long in its more sensational form? And part of the answer lies in the way the story was initially reported and subsequently embellished. The first article about the case, published in the Washington Post in 1949, already contained several exaggerations and inaccuracies. Subsequent retellings, including those by the priests involved, adding further dramatic details. By the time William Peter Blatty came across the story in the 1960s, it had already taken on a life of its own. He was a novelist looking for material, and he further dramatized and embellished the tale for his book. And the movie adaptation then cemented these embellishments in the public imagination. It's a classic case of what psychologists might call the telephone game, where a story becomes more distorted with each retelling, but it's also an example of how we, as a society, create our own modern myths. The Roland Doe case, with its blend of religious fears, adolescent turmoil, and supernatural horror, it spoke to something deep in the American psyche, and it provided a narrative framework for understanding the often chaotic and frightening processes that come with growing up. It offered a comfortingly simple explanation for complex psychological phenomenon, and perhaps most importantly, it reaffirmed the power of faith in the face of apparent evil. In many ways, the story of Roland Doe says more about us, our fears, our beliefs, our need for dramatic narratives, than it does about any supernatural occurrence. It's a mirror reflecting our collective psyche, distorted through the lens of time and retelling. So where does this leave us? Was Roland Doe truly possessed by a demon? Or was he a troubled teenager acting out? Or was he caught in a web of expectations and misunderstandings playing a role that had been thrust upon him? The reality, as often the case, likely lies somewhere in the middle. Roland was clearly a troubled young man, struggling with issues that neither he nor those around him fully understood. The framework of demonic possession provided a way to conceptualize and ultimately resolve these issues. And for those of faith, it's entirely possible that there was a genuine spiritual dimension to his struggles. But in focusing solely on the question of whether Roland was really possessed, we risk missing the larger, more intriguing story. This is a tale about the power of suggestion, the malleability of memory, and the way societies construct their narratives of good and evil. It's also a story about faith, about how we grapple with the unseen, and about the complex interplay between the psychological and the spiritual. In the end, the real exorcism in this story may not be of a demon, but of our own tendency to accept sensational explanations without question. And yet it also reminds us to remain open to the possibility of deeper spiritual realities at work in our world. The case of Roland Doe challenges us to approach such stories with both critical thinking and spiritual discernment. It invites us to consider the complex nature of human experience, where the psychological and the spiritual often intertwine in ways that defy simple categorization. And perhaps that's the most valuable lesson we can take from this strange case of Roland Doe, that in matters of faith and the supernatural, as in life itself, the truth is often more complex, more nuanced, and ultimately more fascinating than any Hollywood script could ever capture.